Welcome everyone to the first open session of the course on competency models in companies. Today we'll discuss what competencies are and what roles they play in a company. We'll also look at an example of how a company used competencies to solve a problem. This course has a website that looks like this, and the course itself consists of 8 sessions. Today we're getting familiar with the concept itself, then we'll discuss how a competency model is developed, how competencies are formed, how they are described, and the implementation of a competency development project. We'll also talk about how competency assessment is conducted. We'll also discuss ready-made competency libraries, that is, where you can find them, and we'll talk about the application of competencies and their connection to other functions. This covers the entire course. Today we'll discuss what competency means in general. We'll explore the difference between soft and hard skills. We'll look at the essence of observable behavior and discuss some common myths. We'll briefly discuss the history and how competencies are used in business. That's our plan for today. In case we haven't met, my name is Mike Pritula. I first encountered the topic of competencies at the STB TV channel. I was recommended well. Some of the first elements were probably at Alpha Bank, where I took recruitment trainings and some trainings on how to train people, and words like competencies were mentioned, but I didn't have, a complete understanding of what they were. For me, they were just another set of requirements for candidates. I was a recruiter at the time and didn't delve too deeply into the details. I applied recruiting techniques, asked questions about competencies that I learned were necessary for these positions, and that was it. But when I delved deeper into this topic at the STB TV channel, where I had different responsibilities, I saw much more. In fact, at the TV channel, my team and I accomplished a lot in the area of competencies because we implemented competency assessments for many positions. There were creative positions, business positions, and supporting roles. It was very interesting. I was an active participant in the process myself. I personally described the competencies for directors, producers, and screenwriters in full. It's very exciting and very interesting. In the end, we developed assessments for about 15 different positions, but the number of people working in these roles was about half of the company. That's about 1,000 or so employees. Then there was wargaming. Here, competencies were approached from a slightly different angle. I was initially an HR business partner, and we were evaluating. It just happened that way. I came in and immediately launched a project to assess the competencies of a group of managers and then further develop this group of managers. Plus, I participated in another project, the case study of which I am presenting to you today. This was a project to build a competency model for managers. At Proble, we used competencies primarily for recruiting and corporate culture. We really worked on the culture theme there, and it was a similar story, also focusing on recruiting and culture. And at Idols, I also developed a competency profile for managers. It has been quite an interesting experience. In my work, I rely on best practices. I recommend you to follow them as well for your own development. And I would be happy if you could share what positions you hold, so I can understand who is generally interested in the topic of competencies, who is with us today, who is watching this webinar. Now, let me tell you about the homework. This course, like any other, has homework. And this is actually great and cool because homework allows you to practice the knowledge you have gained, the topic of competencies. For people who have never worked with it before, for example, those encountering it for the first time, it can be a bit new, complex, and unfamiliar. That is how I would put it. And homework is an opportunity to get support in developing competencies. We issue diplomas for homework. They are integrated into your LinkedIn profile, and you receive them on a special platform, which is quite a cool platform. Other top companies also issue their own diplomas. So let us move on to today's lesson. Today we are talking about the competency model. Many companies want to implement it. Sometimes they even set the task right away. We need to implement a competency model. They might phrase the task differently. It might even sound like something else, but the result will still be the implementation of a competency model. For example, they might say, let us do an employee evaluation and development assessment. Let us establish professional levels for something. Let us establish professional levels for developers. Let's create development plans and job profiles, and we'll develop competencies there. So there might be hundreds of different requests, but they all lead to the same thing: creating a competency model. When creating a competency model to solve this problem in your company, it's very useful to understand how it came about and how this idea developed. In other words, what it actually is, and that's where we'll start. The overall idea of competency became known and interesting many years ago. I wouldn't say that companies have only been thinking about this in the last few years. The idea itself interested people even 2,400 years ago. There's a book by an Indian official, Arthashastra, written by Kautilya. It's about the science of politics, a book that suggests how a king should select people and provides tools and characteristics. And here you can see elements of competency, that is, it's about behavior and various tools for assessing these competencies, which are used today in assessment centers and other areas. So even 2,400 years ago, they were already looking for solutions to problems using competencies. 2,400 years have passed, and unfortunately, companies still don't always know what competencies are. They confuse hard and soft skills. They interview people incorrectly, and then poorly develop people without even evaluating them first. They select people for different roles, also completely ignoring their suitability for these roles and their competencies. So companies make a lot of mistakes, but fortunately, those who know what a competency model is and how it works try to avoid these mistakes. What has happened in the last 100 years? You could say that a great deal has certainly happened in the last 100 years, as in any other field. And here's how it developed. At the beginning of the 20th century, the main required competencies were those that a worker acquired through years of on-the-job experience. Taylor and Ford then began to assess people's ability to perform monotonous work and physical endurance to select people for assembly line work. So for a long time, people were selected based on their experience. If you have relevant experience, you're suitable. If you don't have experience, you're not suitable. And here's that classic example of where people without experience can get experience because everyone asks for experience. This was exactly the problem. Taylor and Ford were among the first to think, well, how do you evaluate those who have no experience? And they came up with aptitude assessments. During World War II, there was a demand for military personnel who follow orders without question. They were also looking for ways to evaluate people who have this characteristic. A turning point came in the early 60s when McClellan wrote a landmark article in the American Psychologist Journal, where he argued that intelligence quotient and personality tests, which were widely used, were predictors of competence. And he believed that hiring should be based not just on intelligence quotient, but also on competencies. This is a person who truly did a lot of work in the field of competencies. Therefore, people who work with competencies in any direction, be it assessment centers or building competency models or something else, they know him. He then founded the consulting company McBair and was invited by the United States State Department to develop new methods that could predict human performance. And this is the moment when companies and organizations started to think about it. What characterizes a person? What can predict their future performance? Because relying on past experience or education from top universities greatly limits choices, and moreover, it often fails. That is, we hire someone with experience, but they don't perform as well as expected. And conversely, there are always some random hires. Someone hired without experience who ends up performing better than those with experience. And the company develops an internal feeling. So, something is wrong, meaning experience is not the key factor. The goal was to eliminate potential biases in traditional analysis of intelligence and abilities. This, by the way, is why many topics are developing in the United States, particularly the topic of competencies, because they have this struggle for equality, the fight for justice against discrimination. It requires finding tools that would allow for more objective problem solving. So it turns out that they have problems, they solve these problems, and they suddenly discover very useful tools. Traditional selection criteria, which at that time were tests of academic abilities and knowledge, did not predict job performance on one hand, and on the other hand, filtered out many candidates from minority groups. For example, people with black skin typically don't have access to good universities, they come from poor families. And so when a company or some organization tries to equalize the proportions of people with different ethnicities, and seeing that they need to hire more people of a certain ethnicity, they can't do so when applying the old selection criteria. There is simply no choice. In solving this discrimination problem, they discovered a new method. How did McClellan work? And this approach is very important because much of what is happening now with competencies actually replicates what McClellan did. That is why it is important for us to grasp this essence. McClellan started by asking the human resources director and some top managers to name their most outstanding employees. And he asked for the names of mediocre employees as well. Then he and his colleague interviewed these people, asking them to describe 3 incidents in their work experience where they thought they showed outstanding results and where they thought they really messed up. And they asked the most detailed questions to visualize this picture as accurately as possible. Essentially, they studied the best and worst performers to understand how they differed, because that's the point. Once we find the differences between the best and the worst, then we can find these differences among others, those we don't know yet. They did this. They actually asked, how did you mess up? And they found out that there were certain competencies, as they later called them. That is, there was certain behavior that the best performers demonstrated, while the worst did not. Simply put, these people behaved differently in the most critical and responsible situations. And this became the key characteristic to distinguish these people. Many skills that the group of experts had previously considered important for success turned out to be completely useless for everyday responsibilities. That is, the criteria were initially incorrect, evaluating something that wasn't actually important. In these situations, it had no impact. McClellan tested his model on a different group of people and was able to divide them into mediocre and good performers. In other words, he was able to use his assessment tools to understand who was who. Using psychological tests on key competencies, he found that employees who were identified as outstanding consistently performed very well on such tests, while those rated as mediocre performed poorly. That is, he found a way to differentiate these people through testing. That's why it's very important. When it comes to people's competencies, for example, competencies in recruiting, when we evaluate candidates and choose the best ones, and competencies in development or competencies in assessment for compensation or competencies in assessment for creating a talent pool or for promotion, we need to start not from abstract competencies but from those demonstrated by the best employees. So this model that he implemented, MCL, is also called the cloning model. When I used to choose training providers, but that was a long time ago actually, and back then training was still mostly offline. Some training providers told me that they could clone our best employees for us. I asked, how? They said they would describe these employees and then be able to teach others and help us select exactly the same type. At the time, the idea seemed a bit far-fetched or fantastical to me, but by applying similar methods in my work and observing how it works, I realized that it's actually possible when we take our best employees. That's how we did it at STB TV channel. I mentioned at the beginning of the class that I was involved in employee evaluation. As it turned out, we had a lot of work to do. I had an assessment department responsible for evaluations, but they were overwhelmed with work. I took on the task of developing a competency profile for directors, and my colleagues who were overwhelmed were dealing with other positions at that time. I personally conducted interviews. I asked the managers to give me a list of different directors. Directors in television are those who are in charge on the set. And I started discussing their successes, their failures, and their behavior with them. It was very fascinating. So I conducted 10 meetings. I personally observed firsthand how some described one type of behavior, while others described another. Then I taught this technique to recruiters. And the recruiters also interviewed a large number of people. And when I finally read the interviews with people, I immediately started to see this behavior, began to highlight it, and we developed a profile. We assessed the directors' competencies, evaluated directors, assigned categories, and started using a more qualitative selection process in recruiting based on what our best directors were doing. So this is an important part. I would like you to somehow remember this and start applying it when it comes to evaluating people. It's worth relying not on some abstract things found on the internet, profiles, requirements, criteria, but it's worth turning to your own best employees and seeing what they're like. And from them, as we describe them, we then try to bring everyone up to this standard. So that's how it works. Let's move on. Thus, thanks to McClellan, a new method was born, which was later called behavioral interviewing, in which interviewees were asked to provide a brief but detailed account of how they handled several critical work situations, both successful and unsuccessful. The method is very popular. I even think that many recruiters use it without even realizing what it is or where it came from. Every time a recruiter says, "Tell me about a situation when you," and inserts any competency. Essentially, the recruiter is replicating McClellan's work, and thanks to McClellan, this method was born. To analyze the data obtained during interviews, researchers developed a sophisticated content analysis method to identify themes that distinguish top performers from average ones. This refers to behavior that was somehow labeled. So here's something for you to think about. Have you ever tried to understand what distinguishes your best employees from the average ones? Because it's very useful. This is how competencies were born, all these themes that were discovered. So now we're talking about communication competency, stress tolerance competency, adaptability competency, and we even have some general idea that there are certain indicators involved. This is the vocabulary we now use called the language of competency. It was developed before us. Back then it wasn't even thought of what they could be. There were just thousands, tens of thousands of different behaviors. This person, the best representative, behaved in a certain way. These behaviors were analyzed, grouped, described, and named. So what we're using now was created by someone. It was actually a big undertaking. They were grouped into a small set of competencies that researchers hypothesized were the determining factors for excellence in work. In other words, it was decided that how a person behaves in critical situations determines how they will perform in the company's future. McClellan's article, combined with the work of Douglas Bray and his colleagues at AT in the USA, in which they presented evidence that competencies can be assessed through assessment centers and success in the workplace can be predetermined to some extent, laid the foundation for popularizing the competency movement. Again, we do a lot of things in our work now simply because these guys discovered it, invented it, published it, and started applying it. The 360-degree assessment we use, we sometimes don't even think about why we're using it. Where did it come from? What are we doing? We just know it's cool. It's good, it assesses competencies, and competencies are important. Assessment centers, the test tasks we give to candidates, for example, we use them and sometimes don't think about it. Why? Where from? And all of this is a continuation of McClellan's work and that of his colleagues. So here's the important conclusion. Success at work can be predetermined through competencies. How does McClellan's approach often differ from the traditional one? Any competencies are described based on what's written in the job description or simply in the job profile through some reasoning that if it's a secretary position, then the secretary must be responsible. This approach is incorrect because it's based on assumptions, but it's not a fact that the best secretary who worked in this position was primarily responsible. Perhaps they were, first and foremost, resourceful rather than responsible. Therefore, the common approach of analyzing job duties and what's written there is in principle not very accurate. If you are describing the required competencies for performing a job based on responsibilities, you are not yet developing a competency profile correctly. If you are not considering the best representatives of this position while doing so, and if it's done abstractly, it's incorrect. Let us move on. What now? Companies rely on past research. Well, few want to bother. They look for simple, cheap ways to describe competencies. They often have to describe competencies for new roles where there is no opportunity to study job representatives. By the way, there is a solution here. Some companies ask, what should we do if we have never had these people? Can't we describe the best representatives? There is a solution, developing a corporate competency model. Universal for everyone, then we simply find the best employees in the company and describe their behavior. Not specifically for this position. They try to find a unified model, develop a model for managers, and attempt to adapt it to employees. Sometimes the focus shifts to job requirements rather than the characteristics that led to effectiveness in the past. And due to frequent changes in company structure, competency models become outdated. What else? Companies sometimes hire consultants for development. Fortunately, consultants handle this well, such as SAHL, DDI, and similar ones, and often HR lacks the expertise to develop it independently. That is why they come to courses. So what is a competency? It comes from the Latin word competentia, which means authorized to judge and entitled to speak. There are different definitions actually. I like the definition that competency is about a person's behavior. There is also a very closely related word called competence. It is a bit different. Competency is a certain skill and achieved level of effectiveness. It can be called professionalism, and competence is behavior. Both are close yet different. There is a slight difference between analyzing competency and competence. It is important not to confuse competency, competence, and simply knowledge and skills. These are also different things. I would not recommend mixing them up. Overall, I like this analogy that says a person's behavior is not just their knowledge or experience, but it is knowledge plus experience plus their self-esteem plus their personal qualities plus their motives. And this is depicted as an iceberg, because knowledge and skills are relatively easy to see and assess, while self-esteem, qualities, and motives are sometimes not fully realized even by the person themselves. You can help them realize it, but it is often hidden. What is good about competence? Competence does not require delving into the study of all attributes and its components. It is enough to just see how it is demonstrated. If it is demonstrated correctly, it means everything has come together in the right combinations. Conversely, if a person does not behave like a team player, it does not matter to us. He is not a team player because he does not know how, does not have the skills, or does not consider himself a team player. He lacks the necessary qualities like empathy, or simply does not have the desire. We do not care what did not work here. If he behaves as a non-team player in his examples, it means he lacks this competence. And when the competence is present, it is likely that everything has come together correctly. That is a plus. But if, for example, you work with consulting companies like SL, they will of course break down competence using various tools, including psychological tests, to predict the presence or absence of competence. That is the kind of thing you can do. There are tests, and I recommend relying exclusively on professional tests. That means not trying to find free tests on the internet. As sometimes people ask, share a leadership assessment test. If you want to assess leadership, go to HR. Ask which of their psychological tests currently best helps predict the presence of competence, because it assesses factors that define competence but not the competence itself. And then evaluate. Better yet, assess the competence itself and don't overthink it. Just do it either through an assessment center, create the conditions for it, or through competency-based interviews. Let's move on. So these competencies, competency, and everything else affect the performance of a person, an employee. That is, efficiency itself is a combination of three components: what, how, and why. That is, professionalism or competency, behavior or competencies, and values, what a person believes in. Now, the difference between soft and hard skills, so you and nobody else gets confused. Hard skills are what we call competency, professional knowledge and skills. These are what a person acquires in courses at university, at work, related to their profession. Competencies are soft skills. They're more about behavior, and they're universal for every position. They usually cover managing people and self-management tasks. And when it comes to fitting into corporate culture, it's also about behavior and competencies. What's important to understand is that competence is, first and foremost, observable behavior. So once again, you should have this synonym in your head. Competencies equal behavior. As we saw in the iceberg model, it consists of many components. Here's the official definition of what it consists of. Competence is a set of interrelated skills, knowledge, and personal characteristics that are manifested in an employee's behavior and determine their success in performing work tasks. When someone develops or describes competencies, there's a set of requirements for them, but now there are many ready-made competency libraries that meet these requirements. A good modern approach is to be aware of common competency libraries, read them, understand this language, and then, when communicating with your employees, determine which competencies are most important in their work and for success on the job. Take such competencies from the library and describe them as fully as possible using behaviors that correspond to our employees. So we use competency libraries, but not mindlessly. We don't just grab something from them, but rather adapt them. On one hand, we don't write from scratch, although that's also possible. It's a slightly more complex task. Perhaps. Here's an example of a competency. A competency has a name, such as, for example, goal achievement. A definition or description, for example, as here, the ability to achieve results by taking responsibility for one's actions, the ability to act purposefully, meet deadlines, and overcome obstacles that arise. And there's a set of indicators. They can be just indicators, in which case they're not called positive, but rather behavioral indicators. Or there can be two sets, negative and positive. That is, positive indicators are examples of behaviors that show the competency is developed, while negative indicators are examples of behaviors that show the competency is not developed. Now, about the levels of competency, there are 3 levels of competency identified. They can be one set, for example, 5 competencies required for the entire organization. This means that these competencies are required from all employees, and very often it's very logical to synchronize this with the corporate culture. There can be a version where each function has its own set of competencies, one for finance people, another for sales people, and so on. Because slightly different behaviors are required in different functions. And finally, the third option is when each position has its own unique set of competencies. This means that even in, let's say, finance, each financial employee, each role will have its own set of competencies. There can also be combinations. For example, there are competencies for the whole organization, for functions, for positions, and for individual employees. It's a combination, a couple from here, a couple from there, sometimes from here. Here's an example of corporate competencies that I developed for the company Ideal. Yes, they will be described here. We also divided them into levels. They were the same for everyone. Yes, it also happens that there's one set of competencies for everyone. For example, communication is required from all employees. But depending on the position, these communication skills are required at different levels. For the CEO at the highest level, level 5, for a driver at level 1. And this is different behavior. This can also be an approach, and some even adapt the names of competencies a little bit. For example, Khan has a 5-in-1 model. They have several types of names for communications, depending on the level, but that's already a nuance. So this is just a description of what competencies are for the whole company, for a position or for a role. Now, how are competencies used in business? Who was first? Philip Selznick, in his book Leadership in Administration, was one of the first authors to recognize that internal factors of an organization, such as personnel and previous experience, are crucial for the chances of success in the chosen policy. For example, A company that has accumulated experience in producing premium quality products may be unable to mass produce cheap products. The competencies that a company develops should be linked to its strategy. That is, the company should expect from all its employees some behavior that contributes to the implementation of the strategy. So these things are often synchronized. The advantage for the company from competencies. In fact, the company gets a lot from this. On one hand, it moves all people in one direction. It allows measuring people's behavior. This helps to develop, better differentiate from competitors, integrate all processes, and so on. So there are many advantages. Where can competency models be used? Well, typically in recruiting to screen and evaluate candidates, comparing their behavior with that of our best employees, focusing on those who match the most, those have a better chance of working effectively with us. In performance management, that is, when annual performance evaluations are conducted, competencies are assessed for alignment with corporate standards. In 360-degree assessments, whether as part of corporate culture management or another process, values are described in the language of competencies. In employee development, for example, when creating an individual development plan, goals are set for improving competencies, building a talent pool. For instance, the company identified 5 most important competencies, evaluated everyone based on these competencies, and selected people with the best scores. And overall in talent management as a tool that continuously moves forward from recruiting. For example, we selected people, assessed their competencies at entry, passed this information to training, and immediately began developing them. Assessed these same competencies a year later, compared them, created development plans, and promoted some people. So we end up with competencies appearing throughout the entire talent management cycle. How, for example, this works in a 360-degree assessment. We create a competency model for the company, prepare a questionnaire, conduct a survey, give people feedback, and prepare development plans. In recruiting, we describe behavioral indicators, include them in the candidate evaluation scorecard, conduct competency-based interviews, and it's great to follow up with a development plan for those hired. And for those who weren't hired, it allows us to give feedback to explain, why weren't you hired? Because for such and such competency, your examples weren't strong enough. Try to demonstrate stronger development in such situations, and so on. In culture, we create a competency model, describe desired behaviors, integrate it into the process, and then conduct a 360-degree assessment. And here's an example from Wargaming from the HR Brand Ukraine project, which was presented. I was on the project team during the launch phase of this project, and then the team implemented it. Employee Development Assessment Centers at Wargaming. I'll skip the slides just about the company. By the way, the company is turning 25 years old soon, so congratulations on that. It's a big company with many employees, so there are prerequisites. The company was actively developing and growing, you could say growing very fast. There were a couple of years where the company's headcount grew several times over, and consequently, the question of creating an effective management team arose because managers were hired and appointed without any unified criteria. The company's managers turned out to be very diverse with different competencies, different levels of leadership, and so on. Some were outstanding, inspiring leaders, while others were just good managers. So there was a need to standardize all of this somehow. Therefore, a team was created that faced challenges. Poor personnel decisions that were made sometimes promoted excellent specialists, but they weren't the best managers, and there was no unified management culture. That is, different managers communicated different approaches. Sometimes they even clashed with each other and contradicted one another, and this began to create desynchronization in how people work and interact. You know how it sometimes happens, we're like this and you're like that, we don't do it this way, we do it that way, and internal conflicts and disputes start, and so on. The solution, an assessment and development center, as one of the first steps, whose task is to improve manager effectiveness by identifying areas for growth. Before this project, business goals were set, but they were in the area of hiring and operations. For example, to reduce risks when hiring managers, identify leadership potential among employees, and create a pool of potential managers. To use a unified approach in evaluating managers, develop internal expertise in assessing managers, and so on. This is a bit about the chosen tool for the Development Assessment Center. It's essentially an SSM center, but an SM center is usually conducted for hiring purposes. The Assessment and Development Center is more for creating development plans. So this is where the company uses this tool. The company chose the solution, or rather the model of conducting it independently, although initially the company brought in experts from the DDI organization. And I can say that after encountering DDI, I was satisfied with their level of expertise and tools. It is quite a good company. It is American. Like Sal in principle, I have also been working with some pretty competent guys now. Here are potential risks and measures taken in any project. In any project activity, it is customary to anticipate risks and eliminate them. And it is also common to set goals for the center's success metrics in any project. How the Development Assessment Center was created, assembling a project team from the Human Resources Department. As I mentioned, I participated in this. And in probably the first 5 meetings of this project team, they involved the widest possible range of people, and I participated, sharing my expertise, opinion, and perspective. Then the team worked in a more closed format, developing what we had generated, studying global practices and the market, selecting and engaging a provider for training expert observers, developing the profile of an expert observer with the provider, selecting these expert observers. In assessment centers, there are people who observe others' behavior. That is why they were trained and recruited. And their training, after which the observers oversee the project under the provider's supervision, certification, and training in developing simulation cases for role-playing games. The tools that were chosen are exercises, psychometrics, and personality questionnaires. And yes, it is common to use these for competency assessment, but it is important to understand that this tool is not the only one when assessing competencies. That is, they are used in combinations. They also use Stress Finder, a talent identification test with individual coaching and group coaching after sociometry and 360-degree assessment. These were the tools. How does the assessment center work? The business client requests an assessment center. The coordinator prepares the design and assessment program to be agreed upon with the client. The assessment is conducted, feedback is given, and the results are presented to the client. What do the client participants receive? Objective information on hiring, employee development, promotion, clear feedback, and a personal development plan. The center's projects, several projects. The first project is a change in the organizational structure, where many new roles emerged and requirements for old ones changed. It was necessary to assess which managers and candidates were the best fit. 20 people were assessed. Here is the set of tools that were used and the project outcomes. And of course, underlying all of this was the competency profile for this project. By the way, I don't think that's mentioned here. The tools are already specified, but the competency profile is the first step. The second project involved 31 candidates. The second unit, where a different kind of task was addressed. And the third project, this is where we're talking about the leader profile. It's very extensive because it covered a lot of people. Human resources specialists developed an effective leader profile and there was a training program. But people needed to be assessed in order to develop them later. How was the leader profile created? There was a global manager survey where people were asked what they thought an effective leader should have and do. Again, it's the same model when we build a profile based on specific people, though they're abstract in this case. Content analysis, identifying key values, translating values into measurable behavioral indicators, that is, competencies. Results, and here are various outcomes of this project. This is how it can be applied in business. There are several myths about competencies, like that competencies are super important. You can bet on them and everything will be fine. Competencies are definitely important, but even a competency superman needs proper management, goals, and so on. The second myth is to focus solely on competencies, ignoring performance and results evaluation. This is also the wrong strategy. Both behavior and results need to be evaluated. This will provide the most comprehensive assessment. And the third myth, that competence is solely innate personal characteristics, is also incorrect. There is an element of personal characteristics, but there are many other factors as well. This means that people with different personality traits can end up having similar competencies. That's the introduction to competencies. With this, we'll conclude our first session here. Next, we'll cover how to develop a competency model. Here are a few resources I can recommend. For those already in the course and for those who aren't yet, I invite you to join us. For your homework, considering the company's strategy, choose the 3 most appropriate competencies from the Competency Dictionary and explain why you chose these 3. And try to remember everything we discussed today. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. Join the course. If you have any questions, feel free to write and I'll answer. If you don't have questions, you can provide feedback on what you're taking away from this, what you've learned, and what was most valuable for you today. You can write that down. If there are no questions or comments, then I would like to thank you for participating, wish you a great upcoming weekend, and simply say, see you soon. Goodbye, everyone.